Then something happens, someone is arrested, and you kind of push it away again, because you don't see the money, you don't see their empire of cash, you don't see it.
Just really peculiar instances where you see just how far deep down the tentacles of the mafia go in aspects of everyday life that you wouldn't ever imagine.
Welcome back to the Mafia's Web. I'm Stephen Drill. I've spent the past 2 years investigating the Italian Mafia and their ties to Australia. I've been trying to find out what, if anything, can be done to stop them. Up until now, you've heard how the 'Ndrangheta, the world's most powerful mafia clan, took control of organised crime in Australia and across the world. In this episode, I'll take you through the world's biggest mafia trial, which is happening right now in Italy. Some of those on trial include Fatty, Blondie, Big Nose, and most importantly, the uncle, Luigi Mancuso, a mafia kingpin. And while their names sound like they're from an off-Broadway comedy show, this trial is no joke. More than 24,000 hours of wiretaps and a 20,000-page court file are being sifted through as the 'Ndrangheta faces the biggest court battle in its history. The trial's so big, they turned a call centre into a courtroom. It can hold up to 1,000 people, including the 355 who are on trial. But in quite the anticlimax, the whole thing now is being held via Zoom.
I was there for the opening of the trial, which is called Renascita Scott, in that vast courtroom, which was opened on an industrial estate because they needed such a big space because of the number of defendants.
That's Tom Kington.
However, what was interesting is that most of the defendants couldn't actually be there because of COVID, so they were all on video conference lines from their jails. And those people who did show up in the flesh were their lawyers. So it was a bit like a sort of mob lawyer conference.
Tom is an Italy correspondent for the Times newspaper in London. He had a front row seat for the Zoom trial. He was actually there in person. Now, there have been some awkward Zoom calls during the pandemic across the globe. Someone is always on mute, or there is a random cat interrupting proceedings. But a trial on Zoom is a whole different thing. In the Mafia mega trial, there were angry shouts from some of the accused as they chimed in from their jail cells. The case will take months, if not years. And what is significant is that the omerta, the code of silence in the Mafia, is starting to crack. Emanuele Mancuso, the nephew of Luigi, a Mafia kingpin who is named in the case as the uncle, is the highest profile informant in the matter. Tom says that in the months to come, the courtroom might be used in person, but for now, it's online justice.
Well, possibly, as the trial goes on, and this could take months and months, and as COVID restrictions are dropped, possibly convicts who are not in jail at the moment, so perhaps ex-convicts or people who have yet to be convicted of other crimes, defendants who are at liberty will start to show up, and we could get a fuller house. But for the time being, it was a bit ghostly. And as you looked up from the empty seats, you saw on the video screens above your head boxes and boxes in which you could see images being streamed in from jails up and down the country. So it's a very, very peculiar sensation of being watched by all these rather unhappy-looking men sitting in the video conference rooms in their prisons.
The case in Italy centres around the Mancuso clan. They were accused of being major drug runners. The Mancusos were also very persuasive. They allegedly infiltrated the local political world. However, they haven't been looking after their own like they did in the past. People in the family are frustrated. They've got to the point where they've questioned, why am I following the rules? Some of the family have now gone straight and become witnesses.
I think one of the heads is the way to put this, because we're talking about one clan, the Mancuso clan, who operate out of Vibo, Valencia, which is close by, but they are just one clan. However, what is interesting is that the large number of turncoats being used in this trial, which is a new thing, because up until now the Ndrangheta has not produced too many people who have the courage to give evidence against their former colleagues. This sense of omerta was always very, very strong in the Ndrangheta. That's changing now. And also I think the publicity this trial has received has sent notice to the other clans that make up the Ndrangheta that they could be next.
As Tom says, the Italian prosecutors are serious. We met Nicola Gratteri in an earlier episode. He's the man behind this trial. The Mafia snidely call him Little Nicky the Cuckold. He doesn't care. He's determined to hold them to account. And for the past 3 decades, he has lived with a security detail. When I met him in Milan, there were 4 plainclothes police with him. Some were stationed outside the hotel, others inside. My passport was checked at least twice before I was ushered into a dining room to meet him. Tom saw Gratteri's attention to detail in the trial.
The number of documents that magistrates come up with for these trials is astounding. They just go into huge detail, and the wiretaps are just going on forever and ever and ever. So, and particularly Gratteri is very methodical. So, no, this is the kind of level of detail we can expect.
Until this trial, many of the Mafia believed they were untouchable. And to a certain extent, they were right. There's a story that struck me. Earlier this year, ambulances in Naples were being held at gunpoint. Not for their drugs, not for any other reason, but because they were turning on their lights and sirens to take seriously injured patients to hospital. The Mafia would come up alongside the ambulance on motorcycles and point a gun at the driver. The frightened drivers were told to turn off their lights and sirens because they were scaring off drug deal customers. That's how untouchable the Mafia feel.
When you hear stories like that, it just brings alive how tight the control is and how deep the influence is at a very, very local level. So, for example, in Calabria, where the heads of hospital wards will need the nod from the local morgue boss before they get the job. So, a guy who's going to be having the power of life or death over people is there at the say-so of the Mafia. For example, when in Naples, there are famous examples of when people want to get jobs and they actually have to pay the Mafia in order to be hired by a company. So instead of earning money at the start, you're paying money and it's going to the mob. So just really peculiar instances where you see just how far deep down the tentacles of the Mafia go in aspects of everyday life that you wouldn't ever imagine.
The Mafia are not choir boys. Antonio Nicaso, the Canadian researcher we met earlier, says they're more business-like these days. But there have been some crimes that have still shocked the world, and those crimes have sparked a renewed push to crack down on the Mafia. Some of the evidence provided by Emanuele Mancuso, the super informant in the trial, has been sickening, and it's taken his bravery to actually make these stories come to light. His cellmate, he claims, told him how he murdered his neighbour, Maria Cindamo, because she refused to sell him her land. The land was in Calabria, the Mafia's stronghold in southern Italy. Days after she disappeared, Maria's abandoned car was found with the engine running. There were traces of blood, but police never found a body. Not a word was heard from her since. Mancuso claimed his cellmate confessed to Maria's murder. He told Emanuele that he killed Maria because she would not sell him her land. Maria was a mother of 3, trying to work her land by herself after splitting from her husband. He fed her body to pigs that had been starved for days. He wanted no trace of her to be found. It's not the first time that pigs have been used to dispose of bodies. A wiretapped conversation in 2012 detailed how the Mafia fed a victim to pigs while that person was alive. Anna Sergi, who we met earlier, says that violence was a way of life.
I mean, there have been a couple of situations, and that's why it becomes so difficult in many ways. So one thing is to have violence on the street. And Calabria did have it. It was before I was born, during the Mafia wars. The Mancuso were never really in a Mafia war because they were too young, in a way, as a Mafia family to participate in one. They arrived when the Mafia wars were already over. So their grip on the village wasn't a violent one. They were many. The clan was big, 11 brothers and their sons and daughters. So in a village that counts 3,000 people. So they spread out, and that was it. So they were entrepreneurs, drug related, kind of this type of business. Extortion came later, and violence came later. So there have been a couple of events in the past years, not when I was younger, but in the past years. There was a bombing of a car. So a car exploded because obviously they wanted to kill someone, which they did kill. It was a political opponent of a guy they were endorsing. And that was a big deal. It was 2017 or 2018. So very recent. So you do see it. But it's kind of like, then something happens, someone is arrested, and you kind of push it away again, because you don't see the money. You don't see their empire of cash. You don't see it. You just see these people coming in and out of prison, and it's just like, okay, this is not the normality of life here. It's just something else. They are something else, which is obviously not true.
Feeding single mothers with 3 children to pigs is low, but the Mafia found a way to go even lower. The murder of 3-year-old Nicola Campolongo cast aside any claims of honour that the Mafia dared to make.
This is the funeral of 3-year-old Nicola Coco Campolongo and his grandfather Giuseppe Iancelli. People here believe they were murdered because of his family's ties to the Mafia.
The little boy was sitting in the back seat of a Fiat Punto driven by his grandfather, whose girlfriend was also in the car. Now, Nicola's grandfather was no saint. He was in the Mafia. The hit was meant for him. But the cold-blooded killer left no witnesses. Nicola was shot in the head at close range. The bullet entry was in his forehead. The killer must have been looking at his young, terrified face. The killers also left a 50-cent coin on the car, a message to say that the victims' lives were cheap. And then the killer poured 15 litres of petrol on the Fiat Punto. That's a car about the same size as a Ford Fiesta. The car burned for hours. There was barely anything left of the 3 bodies. This was in 2014. Pope Francis was so shocked, he visited Calabria in southern Italy, praying for peace. Here's what the prosecuting magistrate had to say while investigating the case. These are his words, but not his voice.
How can anyone kill a 3-year-old boy in this way? In many years of work, I think this is the most brutal murder it has been my duty to investigate.
It wasn't the first time, and it won't be the last. Domenico Gabriele was shot while playing football in 2009. He died 3 months later. Giuseppe Di Matteo was 13. He was strangled and then dissolved in acid. His crime? His father had turned informant. That's the risks that people like Emmanuel Mancuso are taking.
It is true, absolutely, and that's why it's such an insidious thing to discuss. It is always true, but the problem is, in a way, that it remains hidden to many. So the closer you are to it, the less you see it.
Anna says the horrific violence becomes part of life.
The Mafia horrors and the way certain families do foster this culture is very real, but it remains a minority in the village. Then obviously it's a really qualified minority in the sense that its weight is enormous, and its consequences are horrible. But it remains hidden. There is if you allow me a small kind of criminological analysis. It's called a neutralization technique. You can't worry all the time if you live in a place like that. You can't worry all the time about the horrors that are around you. You live with it. You neutralize it. You kind of say, okay, you know what? This is just a bunch of people. We don't talk to them. You just avoid them and they'll go away. at some point magically. So that's what you do.
As I delved deeper into how the mafia operated, I kept hearing about these terrible, terrible crimes. But I was wondering, what's the point? Why are the mafia involved in such evil deeds? How can you kill a child at point blank range? When do you stop being human? My travels around Italy struck me not for what was there, but what wasn't. Many of the villages have barely any shops. I stopped for a pizza in one place on the side of the road, and the guy had to pull up his roller door to let me in. There were no al fresco cafes like outside the Milan Duomo. Even the churches were dilapidated, dusty relics. They were nothing like the churches you see in Rome.
So definitely the money does not stay in Calabria, because if the money of the mafia stayed in Calabria, Calabria would not be the way you saw it. I mean, Calabria is still the poorest region of Italy, and it has enormous problems in terms of managing its own finances as it is. So definitely the money doesn't stay there. And most of the money of these clans is only supposed to be of a certain amount. In many cases, the prosecutors, the anti-mafia district, they don't know. They don't know how much money is in the vaults of the Mancuso clan. They assume it's a lot. They assume certain amounts, but they don't know. And that's the point. I mean, most of the money goes somewhere else. So it's diversified. So the portfolios of money laundering activities is really diversified. Some of it goes to Australia, to Canada, to Germany, to Switzerland, Spain. You buy restaurants, you buy, resorts, you buy hotels. You just invest it in some products in the banking system in Switzerland or Luxembourg, or you give it to your cousin who gives it to another cousin who gives it to another cousin. So it's really diversified, and that's probably the kind of, in a way, the complication about this is that you always think, it's like, when are they actually enjoying it? Are they ever going to enjoy it? Because there is an idea, and this is just purely anecdotal, right? The way I was talking to certain people back in the days when I started doing this research, there is this idea that most mafia families started entering certain businesses because of their families. So they wanted to offer their children a better life in a way, which sounds like a very noble thing to do, even if you accumulate money that is coming from illicit sources. But then the generations go by, and there never seems to be a generation that enjoys it. Not in Italy, at least. Australia is a different story. So it does beg the question. But I think this has to do with, again, the lies that people told themselves. So you do enter a certain life, you do tell yourself the story that you're doing it for your children, you're doing it to give, different, because you deserve better, your family deserves better. But then things kick in, and you kind of end in this spiral of criminality, and you have the police chasing after you, and you can never enjoy it, so you keep postponing it, and you keep accumulating it, and you keep postponing it, and you still tell yourself whatever lie you're telling yourself. But very few mafia people, very few ndranghetisti in Calabria do enjoy their money. It's not in their blood. In a way, it's not in the Calabrian blood, really, to be kind of, to show off the money.
So the mafia is a vicious circle. Violence begets violence. And what all this really comes down to is not having the flashiest car or the biggest house. The true mafia, they don't show off their wealth. It's about power and greed. So small men can walk into their village and feel tall.
It's about status, and it's actually, most of the time, that's one thing that my father always told me, it's about what's inside the house, not what's outside. So one of the things that many people are surprised about when, there is a big operation and they enter these houses, and it's the amount of luxury that is inside the house. So the kind of marble or the art that they invest in, but on the outside everything looks very normal. So it's a status situation. It's a power status, and and prestige, obviously, that everyone around you needs to know about, but you don't need to show off.
The trial in Italy will make for some awkward conversations at banks across the globe. Those on fat commissions in London and Luxembourg might be choking on their Cristal champagne as they realise their rivers of gold could dry up.
London is interesting because there doesn't seem to be much of a physical presence of the Ndrangheta there. However, they can hit a button and send their money through London as part of a kind of laundering procedure. And we know that London is very leaky, full of holes. Some of the checks are really not up to scratch. And so London has been for a long time a kind of favoured destination for dirty money. Otherwise, I mean, places like Canada and South America and Australia, I think, do have more of a physical presence. So we're talking about people within the community of people who are originally from Calabria who've emigrated to these countries, Germany too. And the Ndrangheta will arrive and perhaps try and recruit some of those people. So at that point, they have local representatives. I know that you've had situations like this in Australia. So as for laundering money through Australia, I don't know. As for having a physical presence there, I think that is the case.
The case in Italy is important. It does hold the Mancuso clan to account. But the scale of the case and just how hard it is to crack down on the Ndrangheta shows the wider problem. Anna worries that the trial is a speed hump for the group whose highway of misery stretches across the globe.
I mean, this trial, however impressive it is, it's not the most revolutionary trial. I mean, the reasons why it's attracted so much attention is because of the enormous amount of work that has gone into it. But that's a choice. It didn't have to be 355 people under trial at the same time. It didn't have to be 20,000 pages of arrest warrant, which I'm not joking, it's 20,000 pages of arrest warrant. It didn't have to be so massive. The choice to make it so massive, to keep it together, is a tactical choice from the prosecutors in Catanzaro, who actually are trying to send a message to the state and say, look, we are facing something huge here. We need more resources. We need to take this seriously. But the trial itself is not going to be the end of the Ndrangheta. It's not even going to be the end of the clan. It's the reasons why it's so, it's actually running the risk of being faulty in many ways, because when you have such a massive trial and such a massive endeavor to keep things together, to paint a picture which has so many loose ends, you run the risk of failing a trial. This is what everyone is worried about, that this trial is not going to stand on, that the promises of the trial are not going to be delivered. So this is the worry. So I don't think necessarily this is the way a country should go. This is the way Italy can go, because we have a system in place that can handle maxi trials, as we did in the past. Rinascita Scott is big, but is the biggest, but is not. There are many trials in Italy that are as big as, or just a few dozens of people short of this. Operation Crimine was 330 people on trial. Operation Emilia was 180. So we are used to big trials, but it's not the way to go necessarily, because the bigger you go, the more mistakes you can make. And if something falls, everything else falls apart.
And what does this mean in Australia? Anna says that the Australian authorities are sophisticated. They know how to monitor the mafia. But she argues they are doing it with one hand tied behind their back.
I mean, Australia has put an enormous amount of work into fighting the Ndrangheta in the past years, and I'm always amazed by the amount of knowledge that Australian authorities have of the phenomenon. The problem with Australia is the legislation. You cannot fight something that is transnational in nature, that has so many peculiarities, because different families do different things, they have different reach, they have different connections, and they do different criminal activities in a way that is national. Australia still fights organized crime at the national level. And that cannot, national as in non-federal, non-commonwealth, and that cannot be the case. You have federal police, which is, to my extent, to the extent of knowledge I have, the best authority you have in terms of knowledge on the Ndrangheta. They do know the Ndrangheta. They have people and teams in place, and they know how to fight it. But the problem is they don't have a federal law. They don't have federal legislation. They can't operate unless they are within the constraint of criminal procedure across states. And that cannot be the case.
Emmanuel Mancuso, the supergrass who unlocked the trial in Italy, is already feeling the heat. He is now in witness protection. The reason why he turned informant was for his daughter. He wanted to give her a better life. Emmanuel rejected a cash offer from the Mafia to shut his mouth. But because he refused, the Mafia changed tack. They put a €1 million bounty on his head. But even that is not his biggest concern. It's his little girl. The 2-year-old's mother, who is still loyal to the Mafia, is now holding her hostage. That's the price he is paying for justice. He's lost access to his little girl. In the next episode, I'll introduce you to Luigi Bonaventura. He also turned on the Mafia after leading a life of crime and bloodshed.
Lived as a baby soldier, a child soldier, trained since childhood in a very violent way. My life is a life of constant watching, of constant carefulness, and thanks to luck, thanks to God's help, I'm still alive.
But more on that next time. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. This podcast was hosted by me, Stephen Drill, and produced by Andrea Teese-Evanson. Please follow and subscribe to this podcast on whatever app you are listening through, and leave a rating and review if you can to help spread the word.